Greetings and welcome back to my channel. This is my workspace. This is my space where my hi-fi is and all my records. I'm slowly going through all these avant-garde records that I'm getting rid of, so they're kind of in a mess. Now, I remember once a Michael Fremer responded to someone, a troll who was trolling one of his videos about the way his place looks. And he said, you know, this is not a living room. This is not an open air segment of my house where people lounge. This is my workspace. So that's why my workspace looks a little bit crazy and I guess a little bit messy. And you see all the records behind me. These are some of my gear, my Shindo, my Bob's devices set up. But anyway, I digress. So I wanted to talk about the best sounding records I either purchased or promo copies I was given in 2024. And this video was inspired by Michael from Poetry on Plastic. Now, if you don't know his channel, he has an excellent channel. I've been following him since I think he was a kid, and he still kind of looks like a kid. I believe he's a musician in some sort of U.S. military orchestra or band, but he is so knowledgeable and so articulate. And he did a video called My Best Sounding Records of 2024. So I thought, wow, I should do that because obviously he and I have very, very different records and different taste. I really think of him as a classical music expert. And I'm going to talk about some classical records I got this year. But if you haven't checked out his channel, it's called Poetry on Plastic. Extremely well done. He also writes for Michael Fremer's Tracking Angle, an excellent site. So I just want to discuss the best sounding records I received in 2024. This is going to be a two-part video. I'm going to talk about new reissues as well as legacy records or whatever, used records that I purchased through the year. So let's start out with some of those used records I purchased this year. The Louvin Brothers, Tragic Songs of Life. Now, I first heard this record at Alex Halberstadt's house. I followed the Louvin Brothers for a long time. I think their most famous record is called Satan is Real. And they were two wild brothers who sang these it's country music, real country music. Bizarre, intervals, wild harmonies. One of the brothers, I'm not sure which one, was a real ruffian and kind of crazy and an alcoholic, I believe, and died young. But the Louvin Brothers, it's like, imagine the Everly Brothers as crazy drunkards and womanizers in Missouri in 1956. That's what these guys remind me of, and they're so much fun. And this recording is very stark. It's a Capitol recording, swirl there, and just, I don't know who recorded this or where it was recorded. I assume it was recorded at the big Hollywood Tower, the Capitol reissue, the Hollywood Tower. But it's really stark and kind of scary. I mean, their music's kind of scary. It's very punchy. If you listen to Patsy Cline or early Johnny Cash, that music had so much power. It was really music, like urban country music. I think of music from like Memphis or parts of Alabama or just anywhere in the Deep South. And the Deep South is very different from the rest of this country even now. So that's an amazing record. You should check it out. The Louvin Brothers, Tragic Songs of Life. I love Japanese hi-fi records. It's interesting because now the Japanese are, due to the jazz kisses and the population of that and the popularity of that and the popularity of listening bars across New York and really across the country, there's more focus on the Japanese way of hi-fi, which is, they look at it as a sacred thing because after World War II, no one could afford records or hi-fis. So if you go to these jazz kisses in Tokyo, you'll see very old jazz records played on very old classic hi-fi equipment from like Klipsch or Marantz. And in all that time, especially in the 70s and 80s, the Japanese made a lot of hi-fi records, and they still make incredible sounding records because fidelity matters to them, jazz matters to them. This is the Pro U series introducing Panta Murakami, produced by John Fukamacha. And it's just, beautifully recorded, very fat, very lush, very pinpoint, very dynamic. The music might be a little cheesy by contemporary standards. I forgot what year this is, but it's sometime in the 80s when hi-fi was still popular across the U.S. So that's a really fun hi-fi record. If you go back through the 50s and 60s, early 60s, you could buy a lot of hi-fi test records that tested all the basic things that we still test today, channel separation, anti-skating, frequency sweeps. But this is more music oriented. Dance of the Paranoia, Contact Point, Absolute Space, Quadriga. Sounds like a horror movie soundtrack, but a really cool Japanese hi-fi record. Hannibal Marvin Peterson, Naima, and I forgot where I got this. Sound file series. I'll call myself a sound file. Jazz direct disc. And I actually haven't listened to this yet, but most Japanese, as this is, Japanese recordings of American jazz musicians, if you see them, grab them. There's the Three Blind Mice label, which does Japanese musicians, but their recordings of American jazz artists are almost always stellar. I have several of them, and I use them for hi-fi reviews. But this is a great one. The Sound File series, Jazz Direct Disc. I think this is on East Wind. I'll report more later on that. This is a record I've had for a long time on the Time label, which has famous records by Max Roach and Sonny Clark. But this is classical. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Cyclist. This is a magnificent recording. This is the best version of this performance of Cyclist I've ever heard. It's all percussion, and it's so, the vinyl is dead silent. I don't know where they recorded it. I imagine I could look it up. Performed by David Tudor, Christoph Gaskill, Alois Kontarski, Bernhard Kontarski, and this percussion is so bizarre and super dynamic and really takes you on a journey. It almost sounds like a Looney Tunes soundtrack without the music, just the percussion. It's not as fast as that, but it's a really riveting performance. I have a couple other recordings of Cyclist, but they don't compare to this one on Time. I was in Human Head a couple weeks ago, and Human Head is great. They have an incredible Brazilian section, an incredible Latin section with many first pressings up on the wall. They're very expensive, but they also have a $5 jazz bin, which is really hard to find in New York. And they have these two Ella Fitzgerald records on Verve. These are original pressings. Ella Fitzgerald sings the George and Ira Gershwin songbook, and they have these amazing covers. And they had them there for $5. And when I took them up to Travis, he was like, "Oh, these prices are wrong." And I said, "Yes, these are very wrong, because these are rare records. We don't see these at the Jazz Record Center very often at all." And they are beautiful recordings. I mean, really beautiful, beautiful performances. Music arranged by Nelson Riddle. There's also a series of more easygoing Nelson Riddle with Ella Fitzgerald records, including Ella Sings Lightly, Ella Sings Brightly with Nelson. But this is Ella singing the classic material of George and Ira Gershwin. Now, Fred Cohen at the Jazz Records sold the original box pressing of this, which was really beautiful and elaborate. I think that's a 3 LP set, and it had everyone's original autographs. And it had George and Ira Gershwin's autographs, and they were taken from canceled checks. The actual canceled checks were chopped up and put in this box set. But if you find this on Verve, I don't think this has been reissued at all. They're just beautiful performances. Very grand, very lush, wonderful orchestration. Really great stuff. Moving right along. Last week, I forgot where I was, but I found this Claus Ogerman featuring Jan Akerman on the Jazzman label. Jan Akerman, known as the guitar player in Focus, that they had some big hits back in the 70s, and he was just a brilliant part of that group from the era of guitar gods like Ritchie Blackmore and Jeff Beck and, of course, Eric Clapton. But this is a little bit later. This is from 1981. And it's Claus Ogerman, who did records with Michael Brecker and his own records. I think a record with Mike Maneri, an orchestral composer and arranger, with Jan Akerman playing electric guitar. And it's such a beautiful recording. They do Adagio from Concerto di Aranez, which I believe Miles did. Pavane for an Infant, which I believe is Ravel. Love Remembered, The Seed of God. Bachianas Brasileiras, number 5. Just a beautiful record I'd never seen before. I don't even know if this is a jazz record, but it's a really beautiful recording. Often when I go to In Living Stereo, they have a bunch of records they've played for years that are really, really dynamic. And one of them is a Count Basie record called Ease in It, I believe. And this one is called Ease in It. This is Basie on Roulette. I have another one on Roulette, chairman of the board. And this record, I never really realized till just recently how well recorded it is. Easing It, music from the pen of Frank Foster, how incredibly dynamic these roulette records are. I listened to one this weekend at the store by Joe Williams. Beautiful cover, beautiful recordings. It's all ballads, but somehow Roulette did really great recordings. Most of these records are from the late 50s up to the mid 60s, I believe. And as with many of these records from the 60s, on small labels, there's no recording information. It doesn't even mention the band. And just a killer recording. You know, just as with a classical orchestra, there are things only a big band can do. You don't hear in small groups, you don't hear in rock groups, definitely, because this is acoustic music. But the groups are so tight because they play it all the time, and they can go from a whisper to a scream in like 3 seconds, and it's just amazing the dynamic impact you get on some of these Count Basie records. I think 88's is one, Kansas City 6 is another one. I also have some really, really old Decca records of Count Basie, and earlier Count Basie, but those records, the recordings are sort of far away. It's like they're done with one mic overhead of the entire group. But this is much more close miking of each section, and man, it just wallops you down. It's so dynamic. A record I got into in the mid 70s, Michael Frank's The Art of Tea. This is basically Michael Frank's, the vocalist, with the jazz crusaders of the time: Joe Sample, Stix Hooper, Larry Carlton, Wilton Felder. And this is a very beautiful recording. It's very flat, it's very, very clean, it's very, very detailed. The songs have kind of a hipster, I guess, beating it kind of thing going on, but they're great tunes. I didn't like any of his records after this. They sort of led to smooth jazz. But this first record, Michael Frank's The Art of Tea, has some really classic recordings on it. And I think it may have been recorded at Wally Heider's, which back in the day in California, recorded live. May 75, June 75. Don Henderson Capitol Recording, disc mastering by Doug Sachs at the Mars Mastering Lab. I've never read that before. That's part of the reason this record sounds so phenomenal. But they don't say which studio. I guess we assume it was done at the Capitol Tower. Lee Hirschberg, Bruce Botnick, Al Schmidt, three of the most famous names in recording history. Al Schmidt mixed it, so this was done at Capitol. Nick DeCaro string arrangements. Michael Brecker's on this record as well. Dave Sanborn, Larry Bunker, Jerry Steinholtz, Ed Thrasher, well, he's the art director, along with Crusaders, produced by Tommy LiPuma. There's a reason this record is so great. And the songs are great. John Guerin, Wilton Felder, Joe Sample, not Stix Hooper, the great John Guerin, who did tons of studio work in the 60s and the 70s in LA. I think he passed a little while ago, but a tremendous drummer. Another tremendous drummer. I've been looking at this record for years. It's Klux Click on Savoy. A group led by the great Kenny Clark. Includes Kenny Clark, John LaPorta, Donald Byrd, Ronnie Ball, Wendell Marshall on bass. It's an early Savoy with Rudy Van Gelder, and it gives you the recording information like these old records did. This record was cut for the use of a stylus, 0.001 in width and a speed of 33 1/3 RPM. The use of a wider stylus, or one designed for another speed, will destroy the delicate grooves. Under this type of mechanical abuse, this record will not be guaranteed by the manufacturer. In the early days, when 12-inch records were new, they really cared about the sound. There's a famous Frank Sinatra record, Sinatra in Concert. On the back, they give you the full lineup of all the gear used. So cool. JMI does that as well now. They give you the full rundown of the signal chain. I don't have any of their records in this year. Anyway, but a killer record. A label I always buy when I see them, and you don't see them often, is MPS, Music from the Black Forest. Recorded in the Black Forest, a German label. And specifically this time, the recordings of Art von Dam on MPS. I actually bought 3 at the store recently. Blue World. Art von Dam is an accordion player. He actually recorded for Columbia in the 50s, the late 50s. And the accordion on one hand can be a really corny instrument, but on these recordings, first of all, the accompanists are just top flight. Like this one has Blue World, the Art Van Damme Quintet, Joe Pass, Eberhard Weber, Kenny Clare on drums. Kenny Clare, a British drummer who was very popular, did tons of work, and this is a beautiful sounding record. Almost all the MPS records sound really amazing, and they put out, I don't know, hundreds of records. They're very hard to find. They had started to reissue them in the 2000s, just briefly, then they stopped. But amazing records by Joe Pass, Baden Powell, Art Van Damme, so many amazing recordings. Here's another one I picked up last week, George Grunt's organ, St. Peter Power. This is the weirdest record. It's George Grunt's playing a giant church organ, accompanied by Eberhard Weber and Daniel Humer. I mean, Eberhard Weber must be about 15 here. They're both very young. And this is just kind of a demented record. It's kind of like, there was that parody called Phantom of the Paradise in the 70s, a movie, a takeoff on Phantom of the Opera. And just to hear, you know, there's not accompaniment on all of this. This is not a jazz trio record. It's a pipe organ record. German CRM. Oh, when BASF took over the label and started distributing it. BASF, a chemical company known for producing cassette tapes in the 70s primarily. But this is the strangest record. There's all these giant slabs of church organ and occasionally accompaniment from, you know, upright bass and jazz drums. Just, you know, so if you see an MPS recording, you almost just grab it because they all sound wonderful. I also want to talk about some classical records I do have. I was out, you know, last year I interviewed the VPI Avenger Direct, reviewed. I also reviewed the VPI Scout 21 for Analog Planet. I have the new VPI Forever Series Model 1 sitting over there. I'm going to review for Stereophile shortly. But when we went out to VPI House in New Jersey, Mark Henninger and I, we made a video with Harry and Matt Weisfeld for the Stereophile YouTube channel, our series called Icons. And afterward, we went downstairs. And the basement of VPI House is just like a museum. It's incredible, all the classic vintage gear that is down there. And there are records everywhere. And Harry Weisfeld gave me all these records because he knows I'm not as classically knowledgeable as Michael, obviously, at Poetry on Plastic. But I love classical music because when you're writing reviews of hi-fi gear, just like a big band does, there are certain things a classical orchestra does that nothing else does. The layering, the imaging, the dynamics, wide dynamic range. Anyway, Harry gave me all these incredible original Mercury Living Presence recordings. And I had a few, but he just gave all these to me. Now, these were reissued by Classic Records, I think in the 90s. And they're just amazing recordings. He gave me a Columbia Ravel record. Even the reissues that Classic did in the 90s are really excellent. They're great performances, super immediate sounding recordings. And I just love these records. They have the purple label, and not all the typical composers. Here's Roger's Sessions. And I'm just so thrilled to have these records on Tolderati. I have a few on Tolderati records. They're just, to me, the quintessence of great classical recording. So that's part one. In part two, I'll do all the modern reissues that I received last year for review that I thought were especially outstanding. Thanks for watching.